The title of its class, as I mentioned last time, from Selicha to Avodah, an introduction to the liturgical poetry of Elul and Yamim Noraim. And today we're doing part 2 on Rosh Hashana. So just by way of review for those who were here last week and also those who might not have been here last week and haven't listened in to the recording, which is available online. We spoke, in this class, we're speaking about the 3 main forms of liturgical poetry that we encounter in Elul and during the high holidays, right? So last week we discussed the selichot. We also gave an overview of piyyutim in general. Just 2 words on that. Piyyut is a Greek word which came into Hebrew to signify Hebrew liturgical poetry and also to an extent Aramaic liturgical poetry. It began as a genre in the post-Talmudic period, more or less, in the land of Israel in the 5th century or so, and then it really took off and became extremely popular in really every kind of practice of Judaism worldwide. Although it did take some time for it to pick up in Babylonia and in the rites that kind of are the descendants of the rite of Babylonia. Although, as we saw last week, it did become quite popular there, and actually some of the most popular genres that we know of, namely the selichot, originated in Babylonia, and those who were here in the class on Shavuot, the azharot, also began in Babylonia. So that was what brought us to talking about the selichot, which we saw our form of liturgical poetry that might have originated as part of the Amidah, but also eventually kind of stood outside of the Amidah in the nighttime, the early morning, on all kinds of occasions, and there's great diversity in it, although we are most associating it with now with Elul, and that is actually a practice which goes back several hundred years. So today we'll talk about the piyyutim and other prayers of Rosh Hashana, and next week we'll talk about Yom Kippur. And I should say that this class today won't focus on one specific genre in the same way that the last class focused specifically on the genre of the Selicha, and next week we will exclusively really just talk about the Siddur Avodah. But rather, there aren't the same kind of epic forms or very extensive kind of robust forms of piyyut Rosh Hashana, but there are a lot of other very interesting things that we do see in Rosh Hashana, some of which are piyyutim. So this class will be a little more kind of focused on various different elements of the prayers on Rosh Hashana. So first we'll begin with a brief overview of the prayers, then we'll look at I'll take a closer look at Shacharit, then a closer look at Musaf, and if time permitting, I'll have some additional tidbits of interesting things that kind of happen in these prayers. So first of all, an overview of Rosh Hashanah prayers and their history. And I should begin by saying that basically everything, a lot of what I say and a lot of what basically can be said on the prayers of the holidays in general, in the Ashkenazi rite in particular, we can say now thanks to the work of this scholar, Daniel Goldschmidt. He was a fascinating scholar who began as a librarian in Germany. He actually was able to work for the German government until he no longer could in the 30s, and he moved to Israel and immediately took up a job at the National Library. And in his retirement, he began to create what we call a critical edition, and I'll talk about that in a moment, what that means, of the Ashkenazi rite, and particularly of the piyyutim, of the liturgical poetry that appeared in the Ashkenazi rite. And the first one that he published was the Yamim Noraim, these 2 very, 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 very big volumes of all the piyyutim and all the prayers for Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur. He started on other holidays as well, although did not finish them before he passed away. And then his son-in-law, Yonah Frankel, who's known probably primarily as a scholar of Midrash and Agadah, completed them. And now his grandson, Avram Frankel, is continuing the project. So it began as this kind of one man's work in his retirement, and it became a whole project which has totally changed the face of scholarship and has been continued by his descendants. I should say, though, that he did have a hand in liturgy beforehand. He'd already published beforehand an edition of the Haggadah for Pesach. So what does it mean that it's a critical edition? What this means is that he looked through hundreds of manuscripts and did all he could to try and figure out what the practice was in the different Ashkenazi and French communities, and what the piyyutim should have looked like in all those, had looked like at different points in time, and then comment on them as well. And throughout the class today, we'll bring a few examples from the Machzor, so we'll get a better sense of what goes on there. I should say it's pretty hard to get a print edition of it. They're kind of no longer in print. Koren doesn't print them anymore, but you could get it online for free at HebrewBooks.org. If you have any questions on this, you want to follow up on it, you could just Google that or go to Hebrew Books and search for Machzor Yamim Noraim, and you'll be able to find his commentary on all of these different piyyutim. So now that we have that tool in hand, let's look at an overview of the kind of the structure of the service. So we have Ma'ariv, and as we mentioned last week, there are different piyyutim, liturgical poems that can be written for such occasions to be recited during Ma'ariv, and these are, again, liturgical poems that first came to replace the blessings that surrounded the Kriyat Shema, and then kind of were added on top of the blessings. And these were written starting really with the Kalir, we'll talk about in a moment, starting in the 7th century or so. And it was a genre that continued to be written in for several hundred more years in Europe and elsewhere. Although now it is basically unheard of for anyone to use these poems in the liturgical service in a synagogue. There's some in the Italian Rite and elsewhere, but for the most part, we no longer use this. I guess there's some kind of understanding that people want to finish synagogue quickly at night, but also just because in general, as we discussed last week, piyyut is used less and less in services as the years go on, and especially following the Holocaust. So in the morning, we spoke last week about kind of the main genres of poetry of piyyut in the morning, and the first is the Yotzrot, which, like the Ma'arivim, are liturgical poems that are written to adorn the blessings surrounding the Kriyat Shema. And then we have the Kedushtot, and these are the poems that adorn the first several blessings of the Amidah leading up to the recitation of the Kedusha, which again, as mentioned, in antiquity was only recited in Shacharit on holidays and was not recited elsewhere in the land of Israel other than on holidays and especially during Shacharit, whereas in the afternoon and Musaf, or later in the morning, they usually did not actually recite Kedusha. Although Rosh Hashana is a little bit different, we'll get to that in a moment. And then we have the Torah service, so Genesis 21, followed by the Haftorah of 1 Samuel on the first day, Genesis 22, followed by Jeremiah 31 on the second day. And those are actually pretty agreed upon in ancient kind of liturgical forms, or lectionary forms. Then the initial shofar blast, the piyyutim yushav, because technically speaking, one can sit while listening to them. And then the Musaf, and something which is somewhat unique for Rosh Hashanah, we actually have a Kedushta. The recitation of the Kedusha was done already in the land of Israel in antiquity, and therefore there's specific kind of poems that adorn such a setting, with a specific kind of genre for Rosh Hashanah called the Tkiyatot, which are the blessings over the Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofrot, and we'll talk in a moment about what the content of that is and also how antique this practice actually was. So I mentioned already Rabbi Azar, Rabbi Kalir. And this is a figure who is rather well known in the history of liturgical poetry or Hebrew poetry in general, really because he wrote a huge amount. He had a big influence on Hebrew poetry in general. And I think without a doubt, in my opinion, also I think kind of it's relatively agreed upon, can be considered to be one of the greatest Hebrew poets of all time. And specifically in the rite we'll be talking about today, in the Ashkenazi rite, it's very important that we give him pride of place because the rite gives him pride of place. I mean, most of the poetry that we still recite in the context of the Ashkenazi Siddur, the Machzor, are poems that were written by Elazar Rabbi Kalir. So the first name Elazar is pretty clear. The last name, or his father's name, that is Kalir, is not so clear. It seems like it's a Greek name, Cyril, Kyrillos. The Rebbe is kind of the way of saying son of rabbi, but people don't, and in the Middle Ages, people knew of him, but did not really know what that meant and kind of made up various myths about maybe he had eaten some kind of cake that would give him the ability to create such poetry. And let's just say a few things about the Kalir, since we'll be looking at a bunch of his poems today. So we know that he lived in the Galilee. This can be seen from various kinds of references and also kind of just makes sense given what we know of Jewish life in the time that he lived. We know that he flourished in the late 6th century and the first decades of the 7th century. And this we know because in the majority of the poems, whenever he talks about the rulers who are ruling the Jews, he talks about Christian rulers. And then kind of in some of his poems, he talks about Arab or Islamic rulers. So we can tell that, he probably lived through the Persian and then Arab conquest of the first decades of the 7th century, which he would have seen in Galilee. Questionable how much of an impact it would have had in his own life, given the rural setting in which he lived, or even Tiberias wasn't exactly the central city if he lived in its vicinity. But that gives us kind of a time and place. We know that he composed many, many piyyutim, primarily for holidays and special Sabbaths, and different piyyutim, as we say, authored compositions for different days, and he primarily did it for these occasions. Much of his work survived because it remained and also remains, as I mentioned, in use in some European rites. So let's just think about that for a moment. At some point, as of now in the slides, we don't know exactly when, a lot of his compositions were brought to Europe. They were so well loved that they continued to be used for generations and generations until they were brought to Europe and continued to be used there. Eventually, we start finding them in medieval machzorim from Europe. most of which date hundreds of years after the 7th century. I mean, they all date this hundreds of years of the 7th century, which again just tells you like how popular he was, and also what that means about this Jewish geography, as we say, that the compositions were created in the land of Israel, but were brought to Europe and remained popular there. But it should also be said that although they were very popular, his aesthetic was not always so well loved, and there were parts of Europe, particularly kind of areas that had been under Islamic rule for some time, in which his aesthetic was not particularly well loved. And also a lot of early modern Hebrew writers kind of looked down on his style for being perhaps overly arcane, and as if he was trying too hard kind of to make his poetry difficult and hard to understand. And we'll see in a moment how difficult some of his poetry was. But with that, we also have many works of his that survive in copies from the Cairo Geniza. So we have there copies of works that we know of from Europe. But interestingly, we also discovered new works of his. And we'll see in a moment, I'll see later on in the class, one specific composition of his, which we know of only from the Cairo Geniza. The Cairo Geniza, again, is this kind of cache of Hebrew manuscripts that were rediscovered at the end of the 19th century in a synagogue in Cairo or in medieval Fustat, which were saved because they had been discarded. And so what some scholars think is that the reason why some might have only made it to the Cairo Geniza and do not survive in Europe is because these are perhaps poems that were written following the Islamic conquest. And at that point, kind of the connection between the land of Israel and Europe or Southern Europe had been somewhat severed, whereas the connection with Egypt had not been severed, given that they were all part of the Islamic Mediterranean. So there's some interesting things to say historically about his corpus, but we'll be focusing mainly on the liturgical aspects. Luckily, around 4 or 5 years ago, actually even more, a teacher of mine, Yitz Landes, along with another student of hers, Michael Rand, published all of his known compositions for Rosh Hashana. This is the first volume and will hopefully be a complete series of all of his compositions, many of which still have not appeared in print, and we only know them from manuscripts. So we'll look at that also a little bit today. So some central themes and motifs in all these poems. The first is that God answers prayers. The examples are brought from the Bible, and one of the things that is particularly kind of given a lot of emphasis is that he answered Sarah and Hannah's prayers. And we can go into that perhaps another point, but there's a lot to be said there about how that is kind of the model in Jewish liturgy in general, and especially also in the piyyutim and Rosh Hashana for the answering of prayer is the answer of the prayer of a woman who would like to have a child, like to bear a child, and turns to God for that, and is then answered. Another central theme, the binding of Isaac. And so right in these two stories, answering of Sarah and the binding of Isaac are also the Torah reading portions. That God is king, the creation of the world, and the shofarot, which also relate to God as king, as does the creation of the world, and also to some kind of messianic time in the future. So given that these are the themes, and given that these themes were mainly kind of meditated on or written about by these liturgical poets who wrote the first piyyutim for Rosh Hashana in the land of Israel in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, I think it's interesting to just do a very quick sidebar to see how actually these are themes which are very, very prevalent in ancient synagogue art, really in the synagogues that we discovered over the past century or so in the land of Israel, in which perhaps some of these liturgical poets actually operated, which is quite interesting. So these are synagogues from the Galilee, all of which kind of date to the Byzantine period, so 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, in which it is possible that some of these liturgical poets actually operated. And this is some of the art that appears in the mosaic floors, right? So we see in the synagogue in Beit Alpha, it's kind of actually something of a backwater in antiquity and also today here in southern Galilee. This is a rather famous mosaic depiction of the binding of Isaac. It even says Yitzchak, Avraham, Batishlach, and Hinaya Ayel, different kind of narrations of the biblical account of the binding of Isaac, which is featured very, very prominently on the mosaic floor. This is a synagogue that was built in the 6th century. And Sepphoris, this is a synagogue that actually was in a relatively central city, although it had already kind of declined as a center of Jewish life and was more kind of ruled for the most part by Christians. Also from around the same time, we see again the same depiction or similar depiction of the binding of Isaac. And one thing actually that's interesting is that Zev Weiss, who published the mosaic floor of the synagogue, has argued that actually the panel right here below the binding of Isaac was most likely originally a depiction of Sarah getting word that she will bear a child. So if he is correct, then we see that again, two of the essential themes of the Rosh Hashanah prayers that the liturgical poets of the Byzantine period in Palestine spoke about on Rosh Hashanah are also depicted on these floors. Shofar is depicted in a lot of them as well, very, very essentially right under the Torah arc. And then lastly, I don't want to get too into this, but the zodiac in the center of a lot of these synagogues, which is something which came as a very big surprise to scholars of Judaism when they discovered that a lot of these synagogues had the zodiac depiction, and even more so given that some of them had this depiction of Helios, of some kind of sun god figure in their center. This obviously scandalized a lot of scholars of Jewish antiquity, but I think regardless of how we interpret it, I do think that some of the people who would be in synagogue might have actually imagined, a king, a heavenly king, God, to look something like that, or it might have influenced kind of their understanding of what God looked like. So again, a lot of these themes, which we see, or as I already mentioned, are discussed in the piyyutim, also appear in the artwork. So going back to the prayers themselves, we'll begin with Shacharit. Given that Ma'ariv is no longer really something which is so adorned in contemporary prayer with piyyutim, I decided that we could skip over it for now. And kind of the goal of the next few slides, I'm not going to go through everything. It'll take days to go through all these piyyutim in detail, and we have a whole day to do that next week, or 2 days rather. But I do want to give us just a little bit of like an orientation about what some of these piyyutim are, how we can understand them, how we could begin to understand them, and how kind of just the structure of the prayers work. So on the first day, the Kedushta, like the composition that is recited, is one by the Kaliri. And the next day, it's one by Yekutiel Bar Moshe, an 11th century Paitan from Ashkenaz, who we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about his Kedushta. Atchil Yom Pkuda. So as you can see here, I divided it into 10 parts. And what's important to understand actually is that there actually, a Kedushta is a composition composed of all kinds of other piyyutim or specific piyyutim that make it up. So the first one adorns the first blessing, the Magen Avot, then Mechayim Etim, and then we start having a lot of piyyutim, which adorn the third blessing leading up to the Kedusha itself. This here is just another reconstruction of a synagogue. I'm not saying that Elazar Rabbi Kilir prayed there, but it is a reconstruction of the synagogue in Kfar Nachum, which might have operated around the time that he was himself composing liturgical poetry in the Galilee. So some of these you might be more familiar with. Some of them are no longer recited. Melech Hayon is obviously still recited today, one of the most popular piyyutim, and we'll get back to it. And one other thing I want to mention, just by looking at this entire kind of structure from the macro, is an argument, again, quoting from my teacher, Shemit Elitzor, that the way the Kedushta, as this extensive composition, and again, it could take several weeks to just go through all of the Kedushta to understand every single word and line of it, which he has argued, and this is something which is particularly true in the case of the Kaliri's Kedushtot, is that it goes progressively from more difficult to less difficult. Right, so the opening stanzas of the opening piyyut, the first kind of composition here, are very difficult to understand, and perhaps might have been decipherable by the folks who are the most educated people in the synagogue audience or in the synagogue community. It will be difficult in that the Hebrew itself is difficult, and this is probably not the language that the folks were speaking day to day. They're probably speaking Aramaic or Greek, but also it is dense in its references to midrashic motifs that we now know of also from rabbinic literature. And in order to understand some of it, you actually really need to know rabbinic literature, or you need to know these midrashic motifs that appear now in rabbinic literature. You have to be quite educated in Jewish lore. But as it progresses, it becomes easier to understand. And even if someone didn't understand the beginning of it, they might actually have appreciated the aesthetic beauty of it or the way that it sounded to them. And not only does it get more explicit as it goes on, the Kaliri and some other Paitanim who copied his style kind of returns to some specific themes, which were mentioned in the beginning of it, the more difficult part, and is kind of explaining himself as he goes on. So there's also this pedagogical kind of element to the structure of the Kedushta. And so given what that means, that it goes from more difficult to less difficult, when you get to the Siluk, and we'll come back to this, remember this for now, the Siluk is the final kind of section of the Kedushta, and Siluk means it's going up, it's ending right before the recitation of the Kedusha. That is actually really the easiest, most direct kind of part, most easiest to understand aspect of the Kedusha or element of the Kedusha, leading up to the piyyutim that adorn the Kedusha itself, which we don't really do that much anymore. which are also quite easy to understand and quite ecstatic. Okay. But something which you'll be machzor today, it doesn't start with Atchil Yom Pekudah, it starts actually with Reshuyot. We'll get back to Reshuyot next week, so also worth remembering this. But Reshuyot are piyyutim that were appended to the beginning of the compositions, not just of Kedushtot, but piyyutim in general, in which the paitan asks permission. He asks Reshut. So I'll read this one. This is a very early one, which appears all over the place, but we don't know who authored it. And it says, Misod Chachamim Unevonim, right from the foundation or the secret, depending on how to translate it, of the sages, the wise ones, and from the instruction of those who understand. I will open my mouth in prayer and in entreaties. Right, to entreat and to beg before the presence of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So one of the questions here is, first of all, why does the paitan need to do this, or the chazan, who is then performing it in synagogue, need to do this? And the question is really, from who is he, or what is he asking permission about? So in this very kind of, this is the most embryonic kind of form of the reshut. It can be interpreted in two ways. It could be interpreted as permission, first of all, just to kind of, be the shaliach tzibor, right, to represent the community as he is praying on their behalf. Or it could also be understood as the paitan or the chazan asking permission specifically to actually recite piyyut, right, to recite liturgical poetry and to break from standard fixed liturgy, right? Because we already kind of noted a few times that there is this tension always between the desire to perform something like Hebrew liturgical poetry, like piyyut, but understanding also that it is somewhat problematic, perhaps halachically speaking. So here it's saying, I am asking permission either or to represent the community or to depart from the standardized liturgy and to perform piyyut. And then second to that kind of is the question of, what does it mean, Bisod Chachamim Unevonim? Is this from the foundation or from the secret, for whatever, the permission of the Chachamim Unevonim, the sages who are in the audience, or as in who perhaps appointed him as an emissary for the community? Or an alternative explanation, and I don't think this necessarily have to be contradictory, perhaps like we read together, is that it is acknowledging that the recitation of poetry, liturgical poetry, is okay because in the end of the day, it all goes back to rabbinic knowledge, right? The poetry itself is founded upon Sod Chachamim Unevonim, founded upon the knowledge that has been imparted to us by the sages, the wise ones. Those are the two understandings. This is the earliest, as mentioned, reshut that we have. But later on, for example, in this one, which was written by our friend Yikuti Alban Moshe, which is the one that is recited in most Ashkenazi communities today, what is played up a lot more actually is the belief that, or the understanding that, it is now incumbent upon the chazan reciting piyyut to ask permission kind of God and of the community to be a proper emissary on behalf of the community. Interestingly, as mentioned, this is added on to the Kaliri's composition. The Kaliri himself did write some reshuyot, but it was a genre that actually took form and really kind of began to be more popular following his time. And next week we'll see one from a paitan living in the 8th century, and we'll look at it in more detail. But yeah, this is I was scared almost to open my mouth in prayer. So that's kind of the main kind of emphasis here, is that the paitan does not feel that he is worthy. The chazan does not feel that he is worthy as a representative, but he does not necessarily seem to find any problem with reciting piyyut itself. So how does the Kaliri's composition begin? Atchil Yom Pekudah be'emav kol lechum lesokeda. Absolutely impossible to understand Hebrew poetry. I'll explain it in a moment. But I just want to give you a sense visually. You can see this is Goldschmidt's commentary on, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines. This is Shulamit Elitzur's commentary, right? So 6 lines, you get this many. This is the kind of ratio of commentary to lines. This gives you kind of a sense of the density, right? So you could see Atchil Yom Pekudah. At actually is originally an Aramaic word. Ata came, which was already kind of normalized into Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible itself, and therefore it is Hebrew enough for Kaliri to use it. Right, so Atchil Yom Pekudah, the day of the decision making kind of has come. That is Rosh Hashana.
Be'emav kol lechum l'sokda. What does he say here? Sorry. Right, because within his fear, within the fear of it, every lachum is a way of saying like basar, or what's the word, person, so to speak, is fearful of it, right? Because of what could happen to them. So it gives you kind of a sense of, first of all, how difficult it is, and surprising actually that it was so popular given how difficult it is. And also kind of, that is the main theme of this, and that's how he opens composition of, the day has come, we are all scared. Gashimbo beberach likuda, we are coming forth, bending our knees, because of how scared we are of the severity of the day. 1 second, just want to see a comment here. Can you make it a little bigger for the middle-aged eyes? Ooh, I will. Other ones will be a little bigger. I'm not going to look at this one in too much detail because I just wanted to kind of explain the structure of the piyyut itself, and also kind of give you a sense of the Kaliri's aesthetic, which is, again, you could see, I think it's easier to see how it's surprising that this would be continued, but is also was extremely popular, and this is a piyyut that we have in hundreds of copies, both from the Geniza and from Europe. And then we get to something which is actually a little more understandable, why it became so popular, and it's a little more direct, right? So later on, I mentioned one of the piyyutim that appears for the third blessing is Melech Elyon, right? So this is, again, the central kind of theme, one of the central themes that we already flagged at the beginning of the class on Rosh Hashana piyyutim, and that is, God's kingship. And it is, the original composition was extremely long. There's actually a question for which of the Kaliris Kedush Da'ot he originally wrote this, because usually what happens in piyyut is a paitan will write a specific piyyut, he'll write a specific poem for a specific composition of poems, a specific kedushta or a specific shivata, whereas this one appears actually in numerous settings in the Kalirian corpus for Rosh Hashana. Originally it was very, very, very long, and what we do nowadays is we usually actually condense it in different ways, one way we'll see in a moment, and it's hard to know where he originally wrote it from. It's perhaps possible even that he did write it, and it was so popular that he thought, this is a great poem, I'm going to insert it into multiple of my compositions, although that might have meant that, in some communities, they, and we still do, kind of perhaps recite it more than once over the holiday. Okay, so very direct, we're already kind of later on in Kedushta, and you could tell that the style is easier. Melech Hayon, Lord on high, King on high, Kel Dar B'Marom, the Lord who lives up high, Adibarom, he is great up high, Ometz Yodo Tarom, right? The greatness of his hand shall come forth. La De Adim Loch, he will reign forever. And that's the refrain, La De Adim Loch. It seems perhaps that already in this time in the 7th century, when he wrote this, that he kind of would create a refrain that would be easy for folks to remember quite immediately. And then the congregation itself could participate in the recitation of the piyyut. With that, there are some compositions of his, and we know this also from the contemporary Machzor, that have refrains are a bit longer. And scholars have actually argued that perhaps the Kalir thought of there being a chorus, some kind of choral accompaniment to his compositions in antiquity. We see some of that in perhaps just a little bit of the piyyutim that were written prior to his time, but really it's the Kaliri who picked up as a practice this idea of there being some kind of choral accompaniment to the Chazan. Which is interesting also for what it means about, the professionalization of a synagogue liturgy. Also, perhaps some scholars have argued that this might have been kind of an influence of what was going on in the churches just down the street in the cities in Galilee, similar kind of Byzantine aesthetic and liturgical mode. But, you can continue on, you can see King on high, Melech Elyon, Tov Shochen Ad, right, the goodness who resides forever. Tuvolad, his goodness is forever. Tipach Shmei Ad, he will rule heavens forever. Ladei Adim Loch, this idea that God will be king forever. But what I skipped over are the lines in between. Melech Evyon Balev Rad Shachat Bishol V'Tachat B'Liyud B'Linachat. But the king of the poor king, right, he shall kind of fall apart and go to hell, Bishol V'Tachat, B'Liyud B'Linachat, and he will go down without any kind of comfort. And it says Amatayim Loch, and the question is, and how long? The refrain is Amatayim Loch, how long shall he reign, right? So perhaps this is some kind of reference to the contemporary Byzantine ruler, whoever that might have been. But as Goldschmidt says here, right? For the most part, these are skipped over. Nowadays, there's kind of this, patent, as we say in Hebrew, in which some of those verses are scrunched together and recited with the R closed. But the reason that they were actually canceled out or omitted in medieval machzorim and medieval rites, and then kind of into modern times, is not because of the difficulty in opening and closing the ark, but rather because of censor. Because it was, a lot of liturgical poetry had gone through censorship, particularly things like that, which rightfully in this case, but also perhaps incorrect in other cases, be considered to be disparaging of the non-Jewish rulers who would have been sensitive to these things. And we'll see more explicit cases of that later on with other aspects of the Rosh Hashanah prayers. And I should say that censorship is something which occurred in the Middle Ages. We see that in manuscripts, and of course picked up a lot more severely following the Reformation, and kind of as part of the Counter-Reformation, which coincided with the print revolution, the first print revolution. In which case there was a lot more monitoring of the Hebrew books. But again, already in the Middle Ages, prior to all that, there also were censors, and we'll talk in a moment about other examples of censorship in the Rosh Hashanah prayers. Okay, so we saw some of the main, I think, compositions of Shacharit. We can go into a lot more detail. As mentioned, there's a lot to be said at every one of these lines, but I want to give you a sense of the overall structure, the overall things of kingship and such. Other themes which I mentioned in the start of the class, which are very important to Rosh Hashanah. So some of them are specifically important for the Shacharit prayers, right? So the things that have to do with the biblical election, right? The reading from Genesis, and specifically also from Samuel more so, about the prayers of the matriarchs being answered and the binding of Isaac, are to an extent kind of emphasized more in Shacharit because it leads up to the Torah service, whereas in Musaf, they don't kind of come up quite as much. So Musaf. This is actually something which is discussed quite at length in rabbinic literature itself, in Rosh Hashanah, in the Mishnah and the Tosefta. Siddur Brachot, right? What are the orders of the Brachot? Omer Avot v'Gvurot v'Kedushat Hashem, right? The normal kind of first three blessings. V'Kolel Malchiot Imahen ve'Eno Tokea. And it includes Malchiot in that, and there's no blowing of the shofar. Kedushat Hayom v'Tokea. Kedushat Hayom, one does blow the shofar. Zichronot v'Tokea, Shofarot v'Tokea. And then two additional blessings on top of that of Zichronot and Shofarot. And then it says V'Omer Avodah v'Hodah v'Kat Kohanim, and recite kind of the normal anti-penultimate and penultimate blessings Amidah, without mentioning Sim Shalom, which actually probably had not been instituted yet at this point in the Tanaitic period. Divrei Rabbi Yochanan ben Nori. These are the words of Yochanan ben Nori. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Im eno tokea lemalchiyot, lamu hu mazkir, right? But if one does not blow the shofar in malchiyot, which according to Yochanan ben Nori would be included in this blessing of Kedushat Hashem, why is it mentioned at all? Ella omer avot v'gvurot v'Kedushat Hashem. Rather, one is to recite Avot v'Gvurot v'Kedushat Hashem, the first three blessings normally. V'kolel malchiyot v'Kedushat Hayom v'Tokea, Zichronot v'Tokea, Shofarot v'Tokea, and then includes malchiyot in Kedushat Hayom and blows the shofar. Zichronot, its own blessing with shofar blowing, and then Shofarot, its own blessing with shofar blowing. V'omer Avodah v'Hodah v'Birkat Kohanim, and then it has the final two blessings and Birkat Kohanim. So we see here kind of two ways to structure the Musaf Amidah. No matter what, Malchiot will be incorporated in a pre-existing blessing. According to Yochanan ben Nuri, it's the blessing of Kedushat Hashem. And then on top of that, we have Kedushat Hayom, the blessing for the holiday, and then a separate blessing for Zichronot and Shofarot. Whereas according to Rabbi Akiva, Malchiot is incorporated not in Kedushat Hashem, but in Kedushat Hayom, in the blessing that is normally the middle blessing on the holiday, followed then by two additional blessings. So we'll get back to that argument in a moment, but for the most part, right, nowadays, we actually entirely really perform it according to Rabbi Akiva's opinion, although there might be some remnant, as we'll see in a moment, of Yochanan ben Nuri's opinion. And then on top of that, I'll just say this kind of out loud without looking at it inside, right, you have to have 10 verses on the theme of the blessing for each of the blessing, which is also the kind of practice nowadays. So we see this is actually kind of rare. It doesn't happen that often that the Tanaitic sources talk in this detail about the structure of the Amidah, or really the content of Jewish blessings. But here we have one of the most extreme examples, most explicit examples of that. We don't have time, so I won't read it out loud, but actually the Tosefta records an argument between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, which kind of would then, about these blessings, which would then kind of bring us back to, really as if these blessings were already being performed and recited on the holidays in the time of the Second Temple itself. But we don't have time for that, so I'm going to go now into this insertion into the Amidah, which we're familiar with from the high holidays, which might actually be a remnant of the practice that was promoted by Yochanan ben Nuri. This is the paragraph of V'chen ten pachtacha, right? V'chen ten pachtacha Hashem Elokeinu al kol ma'asecha ve'matcha al kol ma shebarata, right? And so grant that your awe, Lord, O God, be upon all your works, right? This comes right after the opening line, the usual opening line of the blessing, Atakadosh Shemcha Kadosh, Kadoshim L'chol Yom Yiluch Hasela. And it continues until we get to this kind of subsection here, V'timloch ata Hashem levadecha kol ma'asecha, and you will rule over all, essentially, God. So actually, some scholars have suggested that this might actually be a remnant of Yochanan ben Nuri's practice of including Malchiot in the blessing of Kedushat Hashem, not Kedushat Hayom, which was then kind of inserted into liturgy and kept alive in that way. Although it was then used alongside also the practice that was promoted by Rabbi Akiva of having Malchiot in Kedushat Hayom, not in Kedushat Hashem. If that is true, that's very interesting within itself, that the liturgy kind of found a way to make do with more than one practice. And it's something actually which we'll see just in a moment that is actually really a general kind of mechanism by which liturgy is structured and kind of grows over time. And that is that in the place of differing opinions or differing practices, the Siddur and the Machzor kind of finds a way to just combine it, to use different things on different occasions. Hilkach neminu letarvayu, therefore we should say both of them, or Hilkach neminu lekulu, these are, therefore we should say all of them. Those are the kind of the mechanism that, as it is referred to in the Talmuds. And on that specific note, what is interesting here is the second to last line, Kadosh ata v'nora shemecha ve'en eloka mebiladecha. And there's this additional kind of lead in to the ending of the blessing, which ends HaMelech HaKadosh, not HaKel HaKadosh, again, kind of something which is specific to the high holidays and the 10 days of repentance, which might also kind of be something, a blessing that was used in different times, which was decided, well, we're not going to get rid of it, we'll just specifically use it at this time of the year. But so too also this line, Kadosh ata v'nora shemecha, we actually know that from the Cairo Geniza as being the way that the blessing of Kedushat Hashem was used was recited in the Palestinian rite. Kadosh ata v'nora shemecha ve'en eloka mebiladecha baruch ata Hashem HaKel HaKadosh. So the thinking is that instead of getting rid of this line entirely, it's a great line, we'll keep it for the specific use on the high holidays in this blessing. And actually we see, so there it is right there, you can see kind of, I highlighted it for you. And actually you see this in all kinds of places in the high holiday prayers. We see this to a certain extent in the blessing of Ritzei. Right, instead of, there's a lot to say about the blessing of Ritzei, I wrote a whole book on it. But the ending here is she'otcha levatcha biran avod, right? This is a different ending of the blessing, a different chatima than the one that is usually used, which is also the one that is found in the same siddur of the Palestinian, right? A little bit different, she'otcha biran avod, without the word levatcha, but it is essentially the same chatima. I'll say this is actually just a very beautiful machzor. We'll come back to in a moment. Parma 3006. There's these beautiful kind of actually depictions of the Chazan, so machzor from the early 14th century France. So just one last example of that, I'll just say out loud also, there's an example of, a lot of communities say, Oseh HaShalom, instead of Mavrechet Moiseh HaShalom, Oseh HaShalom was the early Palestinian ending. Instead of forgetting it entirely, they specifically kind of just use it at this special time of the year. And also, when in a lot of Ashkenazi communities, as part of the blessings before Kriyat Shema, instead of saying V'ofanim v'achayot HaKodesh b'Rosh Gadol, have this longer version, V'achayot Yishoreru, U'chorvim Yife'eru, U'sorfim Yoronu Ve'elim Yivrechu, just kind of a longer depiction, a little more poetic depiction of the angelic praise, which also kind of harkens back to an early Palestinian practice, which instead of it being forgotten entirely, was given a specific kind of use over the high holidays. And Goldschmidt, this is again from his Machzor, says that in the Western Ashkenazic practice, this is not used. not just in the Western one, also other kind of Ashkenazi practices, and also in the land of Israel. To an extent, this is largely because of the Gaon of Vilna, actually, who was against these kinds of changes, and a lot of actually the early members of the early Yishuv in the land of Israel were disciples of his and such, and therefore it is for the most part the Ashkenazic practice of his opinion, or according to his opinion, that is in practice in the land of Israel, and that's why you might see things in your Machzor that say like, and outside the land of Israel, we use this ending, or in the land of Israel, people don't usually use that ending. It kind of goes back to that original argument. Although it also in America, to a certain extent, this is becoming less and less the practice because Rav Soloveitchik was against changing these parts of Jewish prayer. But you should ask your local rabbi. Okay, so central kind of element of the Musaf are the Tkiyatot. And we already saw a discussion of them. This is another way of referring to the blessings of the Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofrot, these kind of three main themes, two of which get their own bracha, whereas Malchiot is part of Kedushat Hayom. And it seems actually like the one that we say, the one that actually appears now kind of just in the Machzorim, not as a piyyut, but just kind of as a standard liturgy, is actually referenced already in the Talmuds, which is a pretty amazing thing. It's very uncommon for us to find such explicit kind of citations of prayer. And when we do, it's usually in the Yerushalmi, because it wasn't as corrupted over time it wasn't copied as many times as the Bavli was copied. And they're referred to there as the Tkiyata de Rav, right? The Tkiyatot or Devei Rav in some manuscripts. And it says there, this is the quote, Zeh yom tchilat ma'asecha, zikaron liyom rishon, ki chok Yisrael hu mishpat Elokei Yaakov, ועל מדינות בו יאמר, איזה לחרב ואיזה לשלום, איזה לרע ואיזה לשובע, ובריות מי יפקדו, להזכירם לחיים ולמוות. Right, this kind of specific phrase that actually we know of from our Siddur, from our Machzor as well, which is already kind of mentioned in the Yerushalmi, which is a rather amazing thing, and that's why the standard liturgy today is referred to as the Tkiyata de Rav or Devei Rav. And again, it's this theme of, God is gloriful. What the creation of the world is remembered now. Everyone is being judged, the people and the states. But that is not the only one that we have. There are actually all kinds of ones that appear. We are familiar perhaps most with, how also Aleinu is part of the Tkiyata Devei Rav, as we refer to it. We could see here also an example of it being crossed out. Right, these are the lines Shehem Mishtachavim, which were originally written but then crossed out by a censor. This again is from that same early 14th century manuscript from France, Parma manuscript 30067. But there on top of the one of Devei Rav or the Rav, we also see this one, Ehelela Elokai, as it is referred to. It's a really beautiful manuscript, as you can see, and it's depicted here also with some kind of different colors of ink, and also with some kind of slight commentary on the sides. And this is actually also known from the Cairo Geniza. So this is an alternative version, which is more poetic, known both in Europe and in the Geniza. You can see again here, Ehelela Elokai. And it's actually first mentioned in the Siddur of Rav Sadia Gaon. I mentioned Rav Sadia Gaon last week, 9th century Gaon in Sura, who was kind of an amazing polymath, international traveler, who also wrote a Siddur, amongst other works, in Judeo-Arabic, in which he describes Rosh Hashana prayers, and then he says that on top of that, there are also all different kinds of, of different kind of poems and such that were authored on this occasion. Tkiyatot for the Tkiyot, as we say, and specifically, I will bring that of Yossi ben Yosei. So he then goes on after that, on the following page, you can see there, he brings that exact same one, Ahalala Elokai, and he associates it with someone named Yosei ben Yosei. So, as mentioned already in the past, some Paitanim eventually kind of signed their name in their compositions using an acrostic. In this one, we do not have an acrostic saying that this is authored by Yosei ben Yosei, but we have the tradition of Sadia Gaon, and it also appears in other manuscripts with the header saying, this is by Yosei ben Yosei. So who was Yosei ben Yosei? They're all this is not Yosei ben Yosei, this is Aaron Mirsky. He was a scholar of piyyut who collected all the different piyyutim about which there are traditions that they are written by Yosei ben Yosei. Some people say he was an orphan because he had the name of his father, but other than that, we don't really know anything about him at all, other than that he was the earliest Paitan that he is before, or this Paitan whom we know of by name. He seemingly lived in the land of Israel, but we can't know anything really about him other than what we know from his poetry, and we'll talk more about some of his poetry next week. So he also wrote one, and it is recited in some communities today. You can tell that it was originally written to replace the Tkiyata of Rav. He was familiar with that composition, but in most Siddurim and Machzurim, it always appears alongside it, either beforehand or afterhand. And now, on to the crowning jewel of the piyyutim of the high holidays, Untitled Chapter. So, off the bat, we're just looking at it as it appears here in the Machzor of Goldschmidt, right? He describes it as a siluk, right? A siluk, again, as mentioned, these are the compositions that were written right before the Kedushta. Again, the Kedushta is a composition that begins difficult and gets easier as it progresses, so that more and more people can understand it as the congregation kind of comes together and becomes more ecstatic, leading up to the recitation of the Kedusha itself. And as such, this is, written in the most direct, kind of easiest to understand style. I'm not passing any judgment here on Untitled Chapter. I'm just saying that by the metric of the period in which it was written, it is most certainly considered a much easier to understand, less difficult, less ornate poem. Perhaps for that reason, that's also why it is so popular, right? Because it just gets right to the gut. Okay, some other things this on the aesthetic level. Unatitled Chapter kedushat hayom ki hu nora hayom. That first line rhymes. That rhymes. ותשב עליו באמת, אמת כי אתה הוא דיין ומוכיח ויודע ועד וכותב וחותם ותזכור כל נשכחות ותפתח ספר זיכרונות. The rhyme scheme starts to actually not work quite as well anymore. Starts to kind of fall apart. It comes back and forth every now and then. ושופר גדול ייתקע וכל דממה דקה יישמע, kind of rhymes. יחפזון, יוחזון, kind of rhymes. הדין בדין. Not quite as strict though, as we saw in some of the Kaliri stuff. And the thinking is that perhaps this is because it is of an earlier period. And now is the point when everyone says, what do you mean of an earlier period? We all know, this is what it said in our Machzors growing up, that this, was written by an Ashkenazi sage who died as a martyr, Rav Amnon. Not much is known of him other than that, as recorded in the Or Zarua. So, yeah, once they started discovering piyyutim in the Cairo Geniza, already in the late 19th century, pretty quickly they actually came across copies of Untitled Chapter. Actually, many copies. It was extremely popular, such that they kind of realized that there's really no way this was written in Europe. The story there kind of depicts something which happened after the period in which a lot of these manuscripts were written. What's going on? Who wrote this? It appears in a lot of the context of the Kalir's Kedushtot, but it seems like he didn't write it itself. And then, just very recently, we discovered a siluk of the Kaliri. We discovered his own composition for this part of the prayer, which actually seems to be rewriting Untitled Chapter. It says, "V'tiftach et sefer zichronot," right? The book of memory should be open. "V'tizkor kol neshachot," and everything that was forgotten shall be remembered. "Me'elav yikra katev v'chotem yad kol adam bo," right? It will be read out loud, and the signature of each person is in it. And the Kaliri writes, "Kibos farim nifrosim," on that day the books are open. V'chol atumim lo'or nichvasim, and everything that was hidden is opened up. V'ginzei ta'lamot shamit yachasim, and everything, another word for hidden, is there kind of revealed. Kidoresh sefer yachasim me'alav yikared dvarim hanasim. The sefer yachasim will be opened, and from upon it, everything that was done shall be read. No one is hidden. Everyone is mentioned, the good, the bad, the big, and the small. And because what each person did, it shall be done. And the signature he shall place alongside each. Right, so we see that he is actually very much reworking this Untitled Chapter siluk. It's a little more clear here. Mi v'kitzo, mi lo v'kitzo, v'zeh ayetachez ki kitzo nigmar. Right? This will not go on. This one will not continue because it will reach his end, and this one, because on account of his sin, will also die. So, given that it seems that the Kaliri is actually very much working with Untitled Chapter scholars now have gone to the conclusion that Untitled Chapter was written at some point actually before the 7th century. It was already very popular then, to the point that the Kaliri himself had to create a composition that was based on it. The thinking is that it was actually might have been Yanai, who was kind of the main kind of paitan who operated before him. We have 4 minutes. I want to look at two very quick tidbits because I like them a lot. The Kaliri references all kinds of interesting things in his piyyutim for the holiday. One thing that comes up actually is this phrase, Bedat Mikra Mishnah Shabbat Rosh Hashana. This is a composition that should be recited, actually. He wrote it for Rosh Hashana that falls on a Shabbos. And he says they are fearful to recite it today, according to the law, scripture, and Mishnah, Shabbat, and Rosh Hashanah. So it actually seems like he's referencing here the practice of reciting the Mishnah of the holiday on the holiday itself, which is a practice that if you open up your Koren Sachs Machzor, you'll see the Mishnah is printed there to be recited at some point. According to the Kaliri, that was already the practice in the 7th century in the land of Israel. This is a piyyut by the Kaliri's great-great-grandson, actually, which was discovered in the 80s. In which actually it describes the blowing of the shofar on Shabbos. B'Shabbat Rosh Hashanah Neshanana Na'ala. Most importantly here is this line here. Melech hizhir bevad sheyu tokim beveit havad b'Shabbat Rosh Hashanah. The king actually said that they should blow the shofar in the yeshiva, in the Beit Havad, only in the yeshiva, I guess, in the Shabbat when Rosh Hashanah falls in Shabbat. And there's actually one other little tidbit there, which is really, really fascinating, which has confounded scholars. Melech Hiskam b'limud, and the king who has also taught us, sheyesh shofar kashur le'amud, that the shofar in such instances should be tied to the bima, right? Lest one carry it, it should be tied to the bima in the yeshiva, so that it could be blown on Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbos. And these are just two of the more fascinating things in my opinion, but there's a lot of other things out there in the piyyutim of Rosh Hashanah, which kind of reflect the practice of the Jews in antiquity and under the Middle Ages. So again, today we looked at various kind of aspects of Rosh Hashanah prayers. There are some main genres like the Tkiyata, which we'll get a little bit, but it's very different than the selichot or the Siddur Avodah Yom Kippur, in that there isn't the same kind of specific epic poem or that we recite on a holiday. But with that, we saw that there's some central themes: God's greatness, His kingship, the creation, answering of prayers and such, and the shofars that are addressed in the compositions that were written for Rosh Hashanah, a lot of which really go back to the 7th century in the land of Israel and were written by Elazar ben Avi Kalio. Great. So I'm going to stop the share. We have just a few minutes now for questions, if anyone wants to type it in the chat. So next week will be structured quite differently in that we will really probably try and really focus on the Siddur Avodah, so we'll look really at maybe one composition, I think, in more close detail. Is there a way to send anything out beforehand if anyone wants to look at something?
Yes. Okay. If you send us something, we will do our absolute best, and we're usually pretty good about it.
Okay, sure. So I'll try and send it out very soon if anyone wants to look at it over the holiday. Maybe that way we could kind of get through some more text.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you, Mr. Landes, for an excellent class, and for everyone else for being here, being part of Drisha's learning community. I would like to remind people that when we meet again next year, next week, we will be meeting at 9 p.m. Eastern, as opposed to 8 p.m. Eastern, so 1 hour later than whatever you're used to where you are. Our final class of the year at Drisha will be 10 a.m. on Sunday, a continuation of Rabbi David Silber's class on Tanakh. But this class, when we meet again, will be the first class of next year. So I feel like that's special, and I hope to see everyone there. And I'd like to wish everyone a Shana Tova and be well.